everyone, welcome to Zip News. We're here for a conversation between Rebecca Sanford and Hadley Leggett. And today I'm just going to do a little intro and then I'll pass it along to them. So Rebecca is the author of The Disappeared, recipient of the Women's Fiction Writers Association Rising Star Award. She received her MA in International Affairs from the New School in New York City. Originally from New York, Rebecca now lives with her family in Florida. And Hadley is a novelist and science writer whose winding career path has included degrees in medicine, biochemistry, Spanish, and journalism. After moving all over the United States during her childhood, she now lives in Seattle with her husband and 3 children, as well as her parents, cats, and ever-rotating troop of foster kids. All They Ask is Everything. It's her first novel. And now they're going to do about 30 minutes of conversation, and then we'll do 15 minutes Q&A, and then 15 minutes discussion. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. And I think we just wanted to start off by explaining kind of how we knew each other and how we brought this event together. And we met through the Women's Fiction Writers Association back in 2020 was the first time that I heard about Rebecca's book. And that was back and it won the Rising Star Award, and I had just joined WFWA, and so I was kind of like following your journey and like looking at your website and like, oh wow, this book sounds amazing. And then it was really cool because the following year, my unpublished manuscript also happened to win that award. And Rebecca reached out to me and she said, you know, hey, this is really cool. Our books are actually pretty similar. We both have themes about motherhood, even though Rebecca's book has a historical and contemporary timeline, and mine is purely contemporary. There's just a lot of themes that are really similar in our books, and we were both going through this process of publishing together, and it just happened to be that our debuts then came out within a month of each other. Yeah. So it's just super exciting. Yeah. And Rebecca, do you want to start by telling us about your book?
Sure, I'd love to. First, I just want to say thank you to all of you for coming out, and thank you to Zippy's Bookshop, and Hadley, thank you for being here with me. The Disappeared is my first novel. It's a dual timeline historical fiction novel. It's set partially in Argentina in the late 1970s and partially in New York City nearly 3 decades later. And it is the story of a family that's torn apart by a military dictatorship and a grandmother who refuses to give up searching for her daughter and her missing grandchild. And it's also about a young woman who was adopted as a baby, and she discovers her biological identity. And in the course of doing so, she also uncovers some devastating secrets about her own past and also her adoptive parents. Lines converge, and the book is based on actual events in history, and it's inspired by a real-life group of grandmothers in Argentina called the Grandmothers of the Pleasant Way. And I had the great pleasure of working and privilege of working with the grandmothers when I was a graduate student. I was studying international relations. I've always loved to write creatively since I was, but I pursued international relations because I had also studied French and had a background in French and languages, and was very interested in studying women, in particular women in moments of post-conflict and post-crisis society and their role in healing societies. And so my master's thesis advisor at the New School in New York City suggested that I learn more about the grandmothers, and I hadn't known anything about Argentina's military dictatorship or really the history of South America during that time. And so I had the honor of going to Argentina and working with the grandmothers for a number of months, and that really stayed with me.
Yeah, I would love to hear the moment that you realized, okay, so you're doing all this research for your graduate program, but when did you think, like, maybe I want to write this in fiction? Maybe I want to turn this into a story? Like, how did that come about?
Yeah, it's funny, and you may have had similar experiences too with your medical background, but I was inspired to write this story creatively as a fiction story without even knowing it. I was doing research and I was involved in interviews with grandmothers and was welcomed into their homes, and it just observed all of these moments of family members coming together, and was meant to be kind of documenting this in a more journalistic way. But as a creative writer, I was just writing pages and pages in my journal about, you know, what the rooms smelled like and what people were wearing, and all of this very kind of literary work that I just had hordes of when I finished. So was not at all useful for my thesis, but was very useful. And I think, part of as writers, I think writing is the way that we explore just the human experience and learn about things. And so I was just very emotionally impacted by that. And part of the way that I worked through learning about that for myself was to imagine what it would be like through writing and just, through history in that way. So, these women, and you can learn more about, if you're not familiar with the history, learn more about that moment in history, but they came together organically because they were searching for their missing children. And that was really what was the impetus for them creating what became a non-governmental organization that now has been, nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize multiple times. But it's about parents, mothers in particular, and motherhood and the strength of motherhood, which was very clear to me even before I became a mother myself. And I know about the same type of underlying sentiment of a mother mothers who in different ways long to be with their children who have been taken away from them. So maybe you can share with us a little bit about All They Ask.
Yeah, so I call All They Ask Is Everything to the messiness of motherhood, because I started writing it when my 3 kids were very little. They were 3, 6, and 8 at the time when I started writing the book, and I was just going through all those intense experiences of early motherhood, the overwhelm and the joy and the exhaustion. And I was really thinking a lot about how mothers are judged in our society and how it can feel as a mom, like no matter what, you aren't making the right decisions. And there's just really, I wanted to explore the question of what it means to be a good mother. We have such high expectations, but we don't necessarily have the supports in place for mothers. And I think, in your book, mothers were being the opposite of supported, right? Like their children were being taken from them. And in this case, in my first chapter, a mother, my protagonist, is going through a mental health crisis that she hasn't yet recognized. And so she makes a mistake that lands her daughters in foster care. And she's a widow, her husband died, and so she's already struggling, and then to have her kids taken away, it's like the worst thing she could possibly imagine, and she'll do anything to get them back, similar to the mothers in your book that are going to all lengths to get their kids back. And then the second perspective, my novel is multi-POV from 3 perspectives. So the first perspective is the biological mom. The second perspective is the foster mom who gets the girls, who is also really desperate to be a mother and has very high expectations for what motherhood looks like in herself. And she bonds really quickly with the girls and becomes really worried about their previous home life and eventually wonders, should they ever go back to their mom? And then the third perspective in the novel is a grandmother. Grandmother is also in your book, and she's estranged from her daughter, and when she finds out that her granddaughters are in foster care, she becomes furious with her daughter and wants to rescue her grandkids from the system and feels like this might be her one chance at a parenting do-over. So my book is really driven by the conflict between these 3 women and their expectations for motherhood and themselves, and that is the conflict.
Yeah. Did you have to do a lot of research?
I did. I had to do a lot of research for this book because I myself am not a foster parent, and I have never gone through the CPS investigation myself. And so, there was a ton of research that I had to do. I started with doing interviews, which sounds like you were in people's homes. And I started with interviews of foster parents. I had a good friend at the time who was a foster parent liaison. And so she was working with a ton of different foster parents. And she had a lot of stories about the different things that can happen in the system and the way mothers are and are not supported. So I interviewed foster parents, I interviewed CPS workers, and then there's a lot of primary source material available that's online as well. Like you can get training manuals for foster parents. You can get, there's like videos of court cases, and so I did have to do a ton of research. And I imagine for your book, you had to do a lot because you were doing historical research and contemporary.
It was born from research, really, and which is so interesting how you can start with research and then you have this kind of creative inspiration that happens coming out of it. I wrote my master's thesis, and the case study was the grandmothers of the Plaza Mayo, but it was on the role of women in post-conflict, so cultural healing and societal healing. And I read a lot. I don't mean to put anyone on the spot, but we're in the presence of greatness here as well. Dr. Alicia Partnoy is a poet here in Los Angeles, and I'm so thrilled that you're here today. She was one of the people whose work I read while I was researching, and certainly there's many others as well. But this time period in history was so interesting to me because it was so recent. And when I started to research and learn more, it was during my early. My dad was drafted to Vietnam when he was 19, and he fought for 15 months in Vietnam. And so I knew about recent American military history. I thought a little bit. I did not know about Operation Condor, nor did I know about the role of the United States in many other South American regimes. So I learned a lot. And
do you want to tell us what Operation Condor, what that means?
Operation Condor was a U.S.-backed military intelligence operation that allowed for the coordination of information and intelligence between about half a dozen South American countries at the time to really kind of eradicate. And there were many other factors involved, but at the end, U.S.-backed military initiative, and it's part of what is at the heart of there's a lot of history leading up to the military dictatorship that took place in Argentina, but between 1976 and 1983, there was a dictatorship in Argentina, and human rights groups, approximately 30,000 people disappeared, were systemically kidnapped, captured, and their identities were kept from their loved ones. So there was a lack of closure for those who had missing loved ones in their family, and it was intended to create a state of fear. Dr. Partnoy could probably talk to this much better than I could, but the part of what struck me when I did the research was how little I knew. Through public school education in New York State, in Western Europe a couple of years, had done, was doing a master's degree in international relations, so I thought I was at least trying to learn about the world outside of the United States, and it just was really shocking to me how little I knew about South America, and most people that I talk to now, at least the readers of this book, reaction, and so that was part of the impetus. A book that could become a doorway, knowing that I'm Argentina, but I have worked closely and seen intimately the impacts of this moment in history, and really just wanted to kind of open the door to those who didn't know about it, so that they could learn more from people far more expertise than myself.
Honestly, I had not heard of this particular period in time. I mean, went through saying public school education. It wasn't something that I knew about, and I certainly didn't know about the U.S. role in any of it. And so that was really very interesting. And one of the things that I love about this book is it really seamlessly ties the two timelines together. So there's a historical timeline, and then there's the contemporary timeline. And I would just love to hear from you, like, what was that process like? When did you know that you wanted to bring a contemporary storyline into it as well? And was it sounds like my book has a single timeline but multiple characters, and that was hard enough. So you do multiple characters,
and I have questions for you about that
multi-timelines
as well too. So the dual timeline really is a result of this moment in history, which is the generational trauma that occurred as a result of this missing generation that became the disappeared, because you have these children who were put up for adoption without any knowledge of their biological identity, and their grandparents who are looking for them. And, that's something that it doesn't end in a moment of history. It kind of continues on. So I really wanted to show that in present day. And, the big fictionalization in my story is the movement of the protagonist to North America and positioning that, which I think was maybe not at the time intentional, but it was because I was writing it from a North American point of view, so that gave me an entryway into the story. But as you know, there's a character in my story who is my villain, so to speak. I mean, I tried to really make him more complex. I wrote about characters that are not as cool, so to speak. I mean, I know that's a subjective term, about what it was like to write about a character that maybe wasn't that all readers would agree with and support.
Yeah, I think for me, no one told me. So this is the very first novel that I have ever tried to write, and I started writing before I was involved in the writing community, and so I was really writing on my own. And no one had told me that female characters specifically are supposed to be likable, and that like readers get upset when your female characters make poor choices. And so it wasn't so much like brave that I did that, as just, you know, that was the story that I wanted to tell, and I really wanted to explore the fact that mothers are not perfect. And we are human. We don't suddenly be when we have children. And I really tried to explore my character's backstory deeply enough that their decisions would make sense to readers. And I feel like most of the feedback that I've been getting is that they really do, even though maybe my characters are making some poor choices, there's reasons for it and there's relatability. And so I was really trying to find relatability rather than likability.
Yeah, I think that's one of the best things about fiction is if you empathize with the character, regardless of what they're doing, it's really hard to hate someone up close that way. When you're that invested in what their experience is, because we're not that drastically different as humans from one to the next. So,
yeah. Did you get feedback on your villain character? I don't want to name the character because I don't want to give any spoilers. But did you get feedback from editors on were you asked to make your character, more likable or more relatable or more villainous? Like, did you get that kind of feedback?
100%. Yes. Okay. My first draft, he actually had several more chapters, and so did many of the other characters. I overwrote on this book. I was sharing, but I signed with my agent, and she said the only way I'll sell this book for you is if you take him out. She said, I'm very bored by him. I don't like him. I switch his, just flip through his chapters, so you have to take him out.
Take his point of view out, not or take him.
Take his point of view out. Yes, okay. Take his point of view out. Take him out entirely. But I don't want to read his point of view. So I spent 6 months revising the manuscript to take out this character's point of view, and we went on submission and we sold the book. And the editor said, I really would love to see more. Have you ever thought about writing from his point of view?
Oh,
and I said, yeah, I actually did write 7 chapters from his point of view. So they said, could you put his point of view back in? So he has 2 chapters now at the end, which and the feedback I've gotten is, yes, that's balanced. We do need to see the world through his eyes. But yeah, I think that's part of the process. I'm sure you've had similar things that you go through, a lot of iteration with your manuscript as well.
Definitely. I did a lot of drafts. Like the final draft that I turned into my agent, I think was labeled like version 18 on my computer. So it was a lot of drafts and a lot of back and forth. And I did have some of those experiences where readers, you send it to one beta reader and they give you feedback that like, you should probably take this out, or I don't want that. And then you send it to the next person and they're like, oh, have you thought about doing this? And you're like, yes, I did that. And so it's amazing to me that was exactly the editor's feedback, that you needed to put it back in. Were you relieved when that happened?
I thought he belonged there because I wrote him there to begin with. And I think that's part of what, staying true to your own voice is part of just having the tenacity going through this process when you hear so many different opinions about, what it should be. So that's something I've certainly learned. It's humbling, and it creates a different level of perseverance. So.
I'm just curious in the audience, how many people here are writers? Because I feel like we have a lot of writers in the audience. Yeah, we have a ton of writers. Yeah. My high school friend has to raise her hand. She wrote a novel in high school. So I wonder if we could just talk a little bit about kind of some more process questions.
Yeah.
So what was your process like? How long did it take you to write your first draft and then revise?
Yeah, so in total it took me 3 years to write the whole book, but it was over the course of close to 20 years. So I was inspired when I was in graduate school, which was over 20 years ago. I wrote my master's thesis, and I was in Argentina in 2002, so it was 2004. I finished graduate school. I let it sit, and I was doing little scribbles of, the firefly moments and things like that. And then in 2009, I wrote for about 18 months a very long first draft. And I was a young woman, so I identified my protagonist's contemporary storyline. And then my husband and I got pregnant with my daughter. My husband and I moved to Florida, and I pursued my career and raised my daughter. And so I didn't touch the manuscript for close to 10 years. And then I had a milestone in my professional career. I took it out and I started to revise it. And that's when I got involved with the Women's Fiction Writers Association. I really picked up momentum and became a book. But an interesting thing happened with that gestation period of just the letting it sit for a while.
You had it sit for that long.
And the most important thing was that I became a mother, because I wrote the first point of view as a young woman, which I think benefited the character development of Rachel. But then as a mom, looking back and revising those scenes that I wrote with my you know what it's like to hold. You didn't necessarily know that when you're 28 or 32. So that was really an interesting thing creatively. What about you? How long did it take you to write yours?
So mine took 6 years, so not quite as long, but I think similar to you, like the first spark for this idea came for me in 2007. So that was also quite a few years before I actively started writing the book. And that was when I was in medical school on my pediatrics rotation. And I had an experience where I had to be a mandated reporter to CPS. And so that experience was really tough. When I was calling about it, it was really hard for me. The mother of the child had not done anything wrong, but I was required to call CPS because of an event that she disclosed to me in confidence. And so I felt, I think I was 24 at the time, and it was like quite traumatizing, and it was something that really stuck with me. And I thought a lot about her family over the years. And when I became a mother myself, it was really an experience that came back to me. And then I thought about, and meanwhile, I had 3 couples in my extended family who fostered kids and then adopted from the foster care system. So I felt like I was seeing the foster care system from the 2 different sides. And I've always been most drawn to stories that are morally gray and that have really opposing viewpoints. And so I think the story was like sitting there, and these characters were in my mind for like a lot longer than I was actively writing. And I started writing when my daughter went to preschool, because my 2 older boys were already in school, and I suddenly had 3 hours, 3 times a week to like sit down and do what I wanted to do. And immediately I was like, I want to write a novel. I have this idea that I've been thinking about, and I'm just going to write it.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. It takes a lot longer than most people think.
It really does.
Although the writers very well understand this. Yeah.
Yeah, because even when you start writing, I started writing in 2018. So it took 6 years from starting to write to this summer that my book is getting published. And so that process is just a lot longer than you think it is. And there's so many steps. As many of you know, you have to query to find an agent, and you have to go on submission with your book, and then you revise it with your editor. And I'm curious, what was the querying process like for you?
I had a wonderful querying process. My professional life benefited me greatly in this. I was extremely organized. I did research for 6 months.
Maybe we should explain what querying is. I just realized
querying is reaching out to an agent to ask for representation so that they can then sell your book. And you really have to customize the request and make sure that it's in the format that they want. Research for 6 months, lists and different types of agents and all different things, and basically prepared as many queries as I could, which ended up being close to 130 queries. Put them all in my draft inbox. I was not going to mess around. I really have learned.
Wait, so you had them all queued up all at the same time?
All at the same time.
You're amazing.
So I'll listen to how this worked. I'll share, and maybe this is the way to do it because it worked for me. On March 1st, I had them all customized. Some people want a paragraph, some people want a page, some people, all personalized, lined up in my drafts in my inbox. And on March 1st, 2021, I sent out 130 queries, and then I shut my laptop, and I was like, whatever happens, happens. So very quickly, I started to get a lot of rejections, a good number of requests for manuscripts. So I probably a dozen, different, like, can you send me the first 50 pages, that kind of thing. This is all like within the first 4 days. And then within a week, my agent asked me for a call. And I also was getting other requests for calls. So by March 21st, which was 3 weeks later when I signed with my agent, I had 5 offers of representation. So highly recommend this method. I don't know. No, it took me a year to sell. It was 6 months to revise, and then we were on submission for a year. So that's the whole other step to the process.
Sure.
So that was not fast, but the querying went very well for me.
That's amazing. So now whenever anybody asks me advice on how to query, I'm going to be like, you don't want to do it my pathway. I'll tell you my pathway.
Yes.
It's not
Did you do
Rebecca's
like the
pathway.
slow drip?
I did this I was advised that you should send out 10 queries and then wait to get feedback, because if there's something wrong with your manuscript, then an agent will tell you this is what you should fix. So I sent out 10 queries, and from those I think I got 4 requests from that initial 10. So that was like a fabulous rate, and I was like, great, I'm gonna get an agent really quickly. I actually finally got 5 offers too. I didn't realize that that's so.
You probably had a higher percentage rate, because remember, I sent out 130.
That's amazing. No, but I sent out over 15 months. I sent out 105 queries. So it's very similar to you, but I just did it very slowly in a torturous way. Your way sounds really bad.
Yes, I will say I did a lot of work on the manuscript up front. So I worked with the developmental editor. It was as polished as it could be. I couldn't do anything more with it, so I did make sure that was done. But the slow drip, I didn't know that I didn't have the emotional capacity to do the slow drip.
Yeah.
So I just went with a full blast and just cast them in as wide as I could.
That's
and
fascinating.
it worked out. And so it worked out for both of us in just different ways, I guess, depending on how you want to.
And I think in some ways I'm glad that I did the slower method, because I did have an agent who didn't end up being my final agent, but she gave me some really useful feedback. She gave me a revise and resubmit that I think made the manuscript so much better. She wanted me to go deeper with my child characters, and I really just did an entire pass on the manuscript where I was just thinking about the child characters in my book. And I was lucky because the kids in my book are 3 and 7, and I had a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old at a time. So it was very easy to do research on what their speech sounded like and how they acted and all that. So I've had so many people tell me that they just love the child characters in my book, and I think that's because I really focused on that. I took like 3 months to just focus on that aspect of the book. It was during that querying time, so I'm still getting rejections and requests and stuff. But yeah, so I think in some ways my book is better because it took forever to find an agent. Also, my final agent was not open when I started. So I sort of believe that like maybe she was meant to be my agent, and like the universe was like, this is going to take a while because your agent isn't going to open until
I think there's no right way.
Yeah.
There's no right way. I think it really is you follow your own path. Yeah, that's fantastic.
It's a cool story. I didn't actually know that about your writing process, so I'm still sitting here a little shocked.
Efficiency. So I don't know how we're doing on time. We're okay? Okay.
I'm curious about your editing process and how you handle, like going back to the fact that it's dual timeline and it's multiple POV. How did that work with editing? Like if you change something in one character's world, did that affect your other characters? And like, did you struggle with timeline at all?
It was always a dual timeline, jumping back and forth, and that felt very natural to me. I know it's not, some readers don't like to jump back and forth, but it was, for me, playing with time was always part of it. As the revision process went on, and I'm sure you had this too, it became more strategic, which meant as I was writing, rather than just flowing, I had like Post-its all over my walls, and the whole, it gets weird because you're trying to put it together. And I was not very good with reveals. That was something I just gave it all away. So I would just tell everything in the first like 2 or 3 chapters. My agent's like, you probably want to wait and let the reader know later after you've given them some time. So I had to pull out my reveals and be a little bit more intentional about even small reveals. So that was something that was probably more challenging than timeline.
That's really interesting that you say that, because in my notes I had actually thought about asking you, like, you do such a good job of reveals and like hinting at things, but then not telling us what's happening, and so it like makes for a really page-turning narrative. And so it's so interesting that you did that after the drafting process.
Well, thank you. No, I'm a pretty open person, so I was just telling everything as it was. And my editor's like, you're gonna wait and tell them that later, and I was like, okay, well, we'll hold that back, I guess. So I didn't even really realize they were reveals until I had to pull them out. Did you have similar, or did you have anything with jumping back and forth with point of view? I know it's one timeline, but there is an element of time when you're jumping to.
Mine was really tricky with the timeline. That was kept coming up even as I was doing the copy edit. So the way the process works with my imprint, and I think most imprints, you do a developmental edit first. So they ask you for like the big picture changes, like change this character or pull out this chapter and put something else, and you do all the big picture stuff first. And then you go to copy edits, and they get a little nitty gritty. And then you go to proofreading, and that's even further. And my copy editor caught a timeline problem that I had missed, and then my proofreader caught a timeline error that both of us had missed. So it was like, because the characters' timelines are proceeding at the same time, when I would change something in one character, then there would be a comment that another character would make about what was going on in the other timeline, and suddenly it was like it was the wrong day. It was Wednesday in one timeline and Friday in the other, and they were happening simultaneously. And I actually had to figure out a workaround to get them both on Friday. And so it was like, and I thought I'd done my homework. When I created this book, I got a Google Calendar out, and I put what was happening on each day with each character through the Google timeline. And my book takes place in 2017. So I went back to 2017, and I thought I was doing it really well. And then it turned out that I was still
There's
making
always
mistakes that had
something,
been introduced in the revision process.
Right.
I'm curious, so my proofreader was incredibly detailed in that she told me that I had the moon in the wrong phase on Thursday, November 19th of 2017. And she told me that there wasn't a snowstorm on the particular day. Like, were your editors like that precise?
We had a few things like that, but yeah, I mean, probably not that precise. No, I don't know that my team was that precise. That's really good.
Yeah, I loved it. Like, I felt it was really exciting. Although the moon phase thing, I was like, do I have to change that? Like,
It works.
I know, there's not a reader that's going to complain there was a moon that night.
Right. That's where fiction comes into play.
Right, exactly. And yeah, that's an interesting question as far as what you can play with in fiction and what you want to keep realistic. And I feel like for historical fiction, that's even more
Definitely.
relevant.
But even in contemporary fiction, I mean, one of the things we both did was write outside of our identities in a couple of different ways. How was that for you?
Yeah, so as far as for me, I was writing a foster parent character, and haven't fostered kids myself, and I was also writing a woman who was going through the CPS investigation that I haven't had. There was also issues around my initial draft of the book. My character had a mental health diagnosis that I don't myself have, and that was another way that editors were like, well, you're writing outside your identity a little bit. And I pulled back on that particular diagnosis and made it more similar to my own experiences. But I just wanted to make sure I had the facts straight. And so I ended up getting beta readers. I had many beta readers who were foster parents. So a beta reader is a reader who reads the book when you're done writing it, but before it's published. So I had foster parents read it. I was able to, through a beta reading service, I was able to find 2 anonymous readers who had gone through CPS investigations themselves. So I was able to get that viewpoint. And really, I think it was a big question, especially in the 2020, 2021, was like sort of the height of the own voices movement around you should be writing within your identity or within your experience. And so it was a big question for me, actually. I was like, am I the right person to write this story? But I felt like, to some degree, if I had been a foster parent, I'm not sure I could have seen the different perspectives in the same way. Or if I feel like I was able to identify with each of the different perspectives because I didn't have the identity of one of them. So in a way, I feel like it was almost more journalistic for me because I didn't go through this experience.
Yeah. I wonder how many writers feel like, should I be the person writing this story? And then it's like conflicting with the feeling of, I have to write the story. And sometimes, but it's sort of, I know I felt that the whole time.
Did you deal with those questions or feelings? Or
I became much more aware of it during the period that you're talking about. When I wrote the first draft, I didn't even think about that. I wasn't thinking about readers or anything like that. But then as it got further along, and I thought, this is going to probably be a book someday that's going to go out into the world and people are going to make a judgment on that. I think there's a lot of fear, and I still wonder if I still don't know if I was the right person to write this story, but I know that I couldn't have not written it, and it was coming out of me somehow. So I think having as many people as possible read it helps, and I think being as smart and respectful and empathetic as you can be, and really researching, a lot. It's like I got to a point where I'm like, you want to know more and more. And things where I had women who have had miscarriages read my book, women who have or parents who have adopted children, many people who have been adopted. I'm not adopted. And of course, all of the historical research as well. So I think it's really important to have a lot of people, give their feedback early on. And then once it's out in the world, the creative part is done and you kind of let it land and just try to move on to the next thing, I guess.
Yeah. I'm so curious, you mentioned the like moment that you started thinking that it was going to be a book. Do you remember what moment that was when you thought like, oh my gosh, this book is like actually going to go out into the world?
I have a writer friend who has had a lot of commercial success. We both know Sarah Penner. And when I sent the manuscript out and went through the querying process, she was at that point kind of in a presumptive way talking about the book, like this is obviously going to happen. And so were some of my critique partners. So it was really other people that were kind of validating for me, okay, now it's going to happen. And, once I signed with my agent. So it was much further along in the process. What about you? Did you have that moment?
I think for me, it was really when I got a text from my agent that was like, can I call you? And that was like, so I also, it sounds like your submission process where your agent is sending your manuscript out to editors. I also took a while on that. And so I had kind of given up like, okay, this is my first book. It's probably not going to become a book. That's fine. I'm moving on to the second one. And then after I kind of put it aside a little bit, I got a text from my agent that was like, can I call you? And your agent doesn't usually text you to ask if they can call you. Like usually agents tend to, at least mine tends to email first or like, so I knew when I got that text, I started shaking and like, I just kind of started hyperventilating. I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be, it was 11 months.
Okay,
actually.
so similar, yeah.
Yeah.
Similar timeline, yeah.
It was a slow process, but my agent also likes to do the drip method. So it was the same way where we were, and the imprint, they didn't have it for the full 11 months. That eventually it was like,
okay.
Yeah. How about you? What was your submission?
She did not quite my method, but she did like chunks, where she would do 10. And so within a month, we actually had a bite, and then something happened in the industry. It didn't have anything to do with my book, and that fell through. So she did maybe 2 or 3 more of those. So there were like 3 or 4 months between each. It was almost like quarterly. And then in the last one, she called me, and that's when. So they didn't have the manuscript for that. They had it for however long they had it. It was that batch.
Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah.
So what advice would you have for writers or for somebody who's in the beginning stages and like, I think the best piece of advice?
It's funny, and I'm sure you're getting this question a lot of times now that the book is out, and this is my first book, so I don't have a ton of advice, and I think there's actually maybe even too much advice out there for writers. So my advice would be stay true to yourself and stay true to your own voice, and because you're going to hear all different suggestions like we did about what changes, and your story better than anybody, and what your story is supposed to look like. So what about you?
Well, now I think my advice would be like, use Rebecca's querying method. That sounds so good. But I think for me, it's all about community. And I feel like the thing that I did really well in this process was really early on, I reached out to writers locally, first of all. I live in Seattle, and so there's a writing center called Hugo House that's fantastic. Yes. And do you know Hugo House? Oh, yay, that's so fun. I started taking classes there, and I started meeting other writers, and I basically tried to kind of say yes to all of the writing related opportunities that came my way. So if someone said, do you want to join our writing group? It would be like, yes, sure. Like I'd love to do that. And I tried to go to as many events as I could and just really develop a community. And then I found the Women's Fiction Writers Association, which is a fabulous community. And I started meeting different writers online. And I found a couple of writers who write in the same genre as me, and we were all going through the querying process at the same time, and we very much formed a really close group today. And Lauren Parvizi is here from San Francisco to be here. So I feel like the writer friends that I found, it's such a hard process. It's such a long road. There's so much rejection. There's so many times, at least for me, when it was hard to believe in myself. And I really needed to surround myself with people that believed in me. Kind of like what you were saying, when other people that really helped make it real for you.
100%.
So that would be my biggest piece of advice. Just reach out, find people, and rely on the community, because it's such a supportive community.
It really is. Writers are lovely. Yes, they're so kind. Yeah. No, I wouldn't say like the whole publishing industry, but writers in particular.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's very true.
So, yeah. Hadley, it's been so great to talk with you, and congratulations on the book, and thank you for having us here. I think.
Any questions?
Okay. Okay.
The comment is, I don't know if you heard my voice note, but that I sent you. After I read the book, I don't read historical fiction. I read memoir. And I read the book, and obviously I thought it was beautiful and brilliant and all the things, but it actually opened up a whole new genre for me. So, well done. And then question, Hadley, how do you start, manage and achieve the 3 POVs within a book?
Yeah, so I wrote my first draft pretty linearly. So I started writing from the perspective of the biological mom, and the moment she makes her mistake, that's the beginning. And I kind of follow the children a little bit through the book. So when the kids go to the foster mom, the POV switches, and I write from the foster mom's perspective. And then when the grandmother comes into the scene with the children, then she gets her point of view too. And so I was really, especially in the first draft, kind of following the children in the book, because the book is very much centered around what's in their best interest. But it was hard to develop distinct points of view. And I did a lot of work that didn't end up making it into the book, but like I would write scenes from each character's point of view that were outside of the book. I don't know if you did this.
Yeah.
To try to kind of just stick your character in a scene, say at the movies or the grocery store or whatever, and like figure out how they would interact and just kind of write from their perspective. I also did some interviewing them, like pretending that I was like asking them questions and how would they answer. And I also wrote the first draft in first point of view, and the final draft is in third point of view. But I wrote it in first because I find it easier to like slide into the character's point of view and into their heads. And so I think that helped. I feel like that's now part of my process. If I need to draft a new scene, I often draft it in first person and then switch it over to third.
That's great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Since you're talking about characters, first of all, thank you. This is super interesting. But Rebecca, earlier on, you referred to your protagonist as Rachel, but her identity changes toward the end. And I'm just curious, like, how do you think about her identity? Because she sees herself very differently at the end, too.
Yes, yeah, that was a journey. I mean, I feel like I went along with these characters through the whole, and for me, that's the only way you can really write the characters, is to just be with them and see what they're experiencing. So I didn't actually really know until I got to the end how I didn't really know Rachel all the way, until she learns her identity and how she would respond to that. And so I always knew what would happen plot wise, but going through it with the character, I was really like emotionally attached to these characters. And I think I didn't always, like you mentioned about writing other scenes, I didn't do that intentionally, but I did write a lot with these characters. So I had a lot of pages that I cut that just weren't important to the reader, but they were really important to me. So, again, not the most efficient way of going about writing a book, but it was, for me, that's the most satisfying part is being there with her. And at the end, I was like, wow, that's who she is now. I kind of had to feel it with her. So it was a very emotional thing for me, which is how.
Was Rachel not Anna?
I think she goes through that process. She identifies as she does in the beginning of the book purely. That's who she is. But clearly, she's also this baby that has it's a whole and part of that is going back to the inspiration. The colleagues that I worked with in Buenos Aires were children of disappeared parents who were in search of siblings. Between 1976 and 1983, they didn't know. And many of them found their siblings. And I couldn't stop thinking about what that must feel like to have this experience of not knowing who you were, not just because your adoptive parents didn't tell you, but in a way that was sanctioned by your community and your country and kind of like the world. On your own, kind of break through and say, like, I'm going to be all of who I am. So that was a tremendous source of inspiration. So very, very deep core part of the book for me. It's a great question.
Comment. First, thank you for thinking and writing a book, and would be my 14th, but it would be a novel. And you are giving me so much advice. I just wanted to, because I was disappeared in Argentina, and that's why she mentioned witness of the birth of a child in a secret detention camp there, which we've been denouncing. And the relevance, not only the gift to tell this from the point of view who were suffering there, but also the relevance today of this, because we are looking for these children internationally, because some of them were trafficked. You probably heard in the case of Chile, only recently, they have found that thousands of children born from poor families, not disappeared, not a political issue, but during the dictatorship, were trafficked. They were sold, they were adopted outside and internationally. So the relevance of this is to bring this issue now to the table and for people to learn and for people to look for, because we're still looking for about 350 children in the case of Argentina.
Yeah.
So thank you, Rebecca. She's thanking me, but truly, all of us in Argentina who are in this search in the human rights movement are very thankful for what she's doing now here.
Alicia, I'm so grateful that you're here. I'm so grateful that you're you. Your work. It is very relevant. The grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo continue to search for now nearly 50 years for the approximately 500 babies that were born in captivity. They've found and identified 137 of them as of today. They continue to face obstacles. The president of Argentina recently issued a decree, actually just after the book was released, that they are going to stop funding these searches for the children. So some of the national commissions for the right to identity and the genetic data bank and things that the grandmothers have worked for decades to create. So the obstacles continue, but the search never stops. So, and I think the dedication to family and social justice, and we are in the midst of Alicia is a warrior of social justice on a number of fronts, and so I'm so grateful that you're here.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
105 years. The grandmother we
Yes,
were talking about,
Rosa, yes.
she just turned 105.
I know, Rosa Rosenblit, she's
Still
one of the
an
few
activist
Jewish,
and goes
yes.
to the class.
Yes, they wear their white headscarves. She just turned 105. I met her 22 years ago. She welcomed me into her home, and she raised her granddaughter, Mariana, who I worked with, and she found her grandson. Mariana was searching for her brother. It took him several years to recognize and want to be a part of his grandmother's life. That was a kind of a journey that he went through, which is part of what Chris asked about too. It takes time. So
Has your book, been translated into Spanish?
we've sold the English global rights. So it's in English now, hardcover, Audible, in a paperback next year, but we still have the rights to foreign language, so we have not sold them yet. But I got that question several times about just translating to Spanish. I do think because I was the one that wrote it and I'm an American, I think maybe the target audience is more a North American audience that doesn't know as much about that period in history, but would love to see it get translated.
And sorry, do all of your community in Argentina, like, do they know about the book? And
I sent a copy to Estela de friends and people that I keep in touch with in Argentina still, who are, very, very glad and supportive. But this is, kind of it's a historical fiction story in North America. There's many real life things that are happening today that the grandmothers, I think, are, they're a non-governmental organization on a global scale, and they have many things that they're combating. But I hope that I can add to the support in that way.
it's really cool.
Yeah.
Great, well, thank you so much.
What are you both working on now? And what can we expect to read in the future?
Well, we were just chatting beforehand about how much of a hard time we're having with our second book. So I think we're both in the same kind of, not stuck place, but just like things are moving slowly. I have almost a full draft of my second book, what may become my second book. And it's similar in that it's book club fiction and it deals with similar themes. It's more about marriage and gender roles. And so but it's still multiple point of view and still kind of morally gray areas. And I don't have like a neat, tidy little pitch for it yet, but
Okay.
yeah, I'm still working.
Yeah, I would say I'm similar to you. I'm thinking a lot about the second book. I'm probably halfway through or getting close to halfway through. It's really coming, like it's flowing for me, but I haven't had enough time, my challenge is just getting the time to be able to do it. But the thoughts, like the inspiration is actually, since this book came out, for some reason, it's just a flood of inspiration for the second book. Also dual timeline, elements of some kind of backstory, political dynamics between France and Algeria. So I spent a lot of time in the south of France, and so there's some of that, but it also is themes of gender, power, contemporary storyline of a woman who is called back to, well, I'm not ready to pitch, so.
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Last call. Great, thank you so much. Cool. So we have a bunch of books up here to sign and purchase, and we'll give you guys in there. Thank you.
I have it, but I have to go. No, I have to have it. Needs to.